As the first officer moved toward his patrol car, his steps were heavy, his demeanor tense. The second officer followed closely, glancing back at the crowd and then at the elderly woman. "We'll make sure this is handled properly," he assured her, but there was something in his tone that left people questioning whether justice would truly be served. Just as the officers prepared to leave, another bystander stepped forward. "Wait," the man called out, holding up his phone. "You're not going to believe this." He quickly pulled up his video recording, pointing to a detail most had missed in the chaos. The camera zoomed in on the moment just before the impact, capturing a flash of movement in the passenger seat of the patrol car. The crowd leaned in, watching intently. The footage revealed a second figure in the car, another officer, motioning urgently to the driver moments before the collision. Gasps rippled through the group. Who was this passenger, and why hadn't they stepped in to stop what happened? The first officer froze, his face betraying a mix of shock and fear. The second officer's eyes narrowed as he studied the footage, his jaw tightening. "This changes everything," he muttered under his breath. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about something deeper, something that hadn't yet come to light. As the cars pulled away, the crowd stood in silence, their phones still recording, knowing that the real truth was yet to unfold. The events of that day didn't end at the crosswalk, but what followed brought clarity and closure to a chaotic scene. At the station, the video evidence and testimonies from witnesses were carefully reviewed. The passenger in the patrol car, revealed to be a junior officer in training, admitted to noticing the elderly woman in the crosswalk, but hesitated to speak up forcefully. This hesitation, combined with the first officer's moment of distraction, had led to the unfortunate collision. The department took immediate action. The first officer was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, while the junior officer was reassigned to additional training to ensure they could respond better in future situations. For the elderly woman, justice came in the form of accountability. The department publicly apologized to her and covered all her medical expenses, ensuring she received the care she needed. She later spoke out about the importance of vigilance and respect, reminding everyone that even small moments of carelessness can have significant consequences. The crowd that had gathered that day didn't forget what they witnessed. Many shared their videos and stories online, sparking widespread discussions about the importance of accountability, the responsibility of those in authority, and the power of community in demanding justice. What could have been an incident swept under the rug instead became a catalyst for change, reminding people everywhere that their voices matter. As for the elderly woman, she recovered and returned to her normal life, carrying with her the strength she showed that day. And while the story ended with lessons learned, it left a lasting reminder. Whether a pedestrian, a bystander, or someone in uniform, we all have a role to play ensuring safety and respect for one another. The officer's patrol car, still idling in the middle of the crosswalk, seemed to symbolize the unresolved chaos. The second officer glanced at his partner, his expression hardening. It was clear something had to give, but what would happen next? The situation felt like a ticking clock, with everyone wondering if justice, or more conflict, would come first. The tension on the street was palpable, every second dragging on as if the air itself had thickened. The elderly woman, now sitting upright but clearly in discomfort, looked between the two officers. Her voice broke the uneasy silence. "Why didn't you stop?" she asked the first officer, her words trembling yet steady enough to make the crowd quiet down. It was the question on everyone's mind, and now it hung in the air, unanswered. The first officer opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. His shoulders stiffened, and his gaze dropped to the ground. Before he could say a word, the second officer turned to him, his face stern and unyielding. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't looking for excuses. The crowd leaned in, their phones still recording every moment. The man who had shouted earlier stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "We all saw it. She was crossing, and he just kept going," he said, pointing at the first officer. Gasps rippled through the crowd as others began voicing their agreement. The second officer raised a hand to calm the growing unrest, but it was clear the situation was spiraling. Meanwhile, the elderly woman shifted uncomfortably, wincing as she tried to adjust her position. A young woman from the crowd rushed forward to offer her a water bottle, her face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, kneeling beside her. The first officer, still silent, finally looked up, his face a mix of regret and defiance. But before he could respond, a voice crackled over the radio clipped to the second officer's shoulder. The words were unclear, but whatever was said made him pause, his jaw tightening as he processed the message. The crowd grew even quieter, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The moment felt like a breaking point, and everyone stood frozen, waiting for the next move. The second officer's radio call seemed to shift the energy on the street entirely. His face tightened, and he gave a sharp nod, signaling that he understood the message. The crowd exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing with every passing moment. The officer took a deep breath, then turned back to his partner. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low but audible enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. The first officer's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened, and his posture stiffened as though he knew exactly what was coming. Before he could speak, the second officer continued, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. "I just received a report. You were speeding through this zone without your lights or siren on. Care to explain that?" His words hit like a thunderclap, sending a wave of gasps through the crowd. The first officer's silence spoke volumes. The crowd, now growing restless, began to buzz with speculation. He wasn't even on an emergency call. Someone whispered, their voice tinged with outrage. What was he doing speeding through a crosswalk? Another chimed in. The weight of their questions hung heavy in the air. Meanwhile, the elderly woman, still seated on the pavement, looked up at the officers with a mixture of confusion and anger. She opened her mouth to speak, but was interrupted by another voice from the crowd. A bystander had stepped forward, their phone in hand. "I have it all recorded," they said firmly. "The whole thing, from the moment he sped through the intersection to when he hit her. This needs to be addressed." The first officer's face paled, his composure visibly cracking. The second officer stared at him for a long moment before stepping aside and gesturing toward his patrol car. "Let's take this conversation back to the station," he said, his voice calm but resolute. But the tension in the air suggested that this was far from over. The crowd, now fully invested, stayed rooted in place, their phones still rolling as they waited to see what would happen next. The story had taken an unexpected turn, and the stakes were higher than ever. The second officer's words seemed to signal the end of the confrontation, but the crowd wasn't ready to disperse. The elderly woman, with help from a bystander, managed to stand, her movements slow but determined. "I'm going to the station too," she said, her voice resolute. Her statement drew nods of approval from the onlookers, who were determined not to let this incident be swept aside. It was an ordinary day on a quiet city street, until something shocking unfolded right in the middle of the crosswalk. An elderly woman, slowly making her way across, found herself in a situation no one could have imagined. Out of nowhere, a police car, instead of stopping for her, kept moving forward, knocking her to the ground. The scene stunned bystanders, who froze in disbelief as they watched what happened next. This story isn't just about a simple accident, it's about accountability, the choices we make, and the unexpected consequences that follow. The officer driving the car, someone who should represent safety and trust, now faced a moment of reckoning. How could something like this happen? Was it carelessness? A misunderstanding? Or something more troubling? What happened next sent shockwaves through the crowd. The moment was tense, the officer stepping out of the car, the elderly woman still lying on the crosswalk, and people starting to gather, their phones recording every second. This was not going to be brushed under the rug. Justice, it seemed, was about to unfold in real time, but not in the way anyone expected. Stay tuned, because this story takes a surprising turn. From an act that appeared reckless and thoughtless comes a chain of events that left everyone watching in disbelief. What happened to the officer? What became of the elderly woman? And how did this one moment spark a conversation about responsibility and integrity? The answers will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't go anywhere. This is a story you don't want to miss. As the officer approached the woman lying on the crosswalk, the atmosphere grew heavy with tension. Onlookers murmured amongst themselves, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The woman, visibly shaken, struggled to sit up, clutching her arm as though in pain. Her frail figure was a stark reminder of how vulnerable she was in this moment. The officer hesitated for a second, his expression unreadable, before stepping closer. Was he going to help her? Apologize? Or simply try to explain what had just happened? Witnesses couldn't help but wonder how it had come to this. The crosswalk was clear, the traffic light working perfectly, so why hadn't the officer stopped in time? Was it a moment of distraction, or was something deeper at play? The woman had been walking at her own pace, cautious but steady. She had every right to cross safely, just like anyone else. By now, a small crowd had gathered. People pulled out their phones to capture the scene, whispering their thoughts about whether the officer would take responsibility. The tension grew as more questions lingered in the air. Some bystanders tried to comfort the woman, while others directed sharp looks at the officer, their frustration evident. It was hard to ignore the growing sense that this wasn't just an accident. It felt personal to many watching. Then, something unexpected happened. Another officer arrived on the scene, stepping out of their patrol car with a look of urgency. The two exchanged a brief but serious conversation, their body language giving away that this situation was quickly escalating. Meanwhile, the elderly woman remained on the ground, her face showing both fear and confusion. The crowd watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. The story was far from over. As the second officer crouched down to check on the elderly woman, the atmosphere thickened. The onlookers strained to hear the exchange between the officers, but their words were muffled. The woman's quiet voice broke through, trembling as she tried to explain what had happened. "I was just crossing," she said softly, her tone a mixture of disbelief and pain. The second officer nodded, his expression growing more serious with every passing second. Meanwhile, the first officer stood a few feet away, visibly uncomfortable. His hands fidgeted at his belt, and his eyes darted between the woman, his colleague, and the growing crowd. He seemed to know this wasn't just another routine moment, it was something bigger. The tension between the two officers was becoming more evident, as though they were silently navigating a complex situation. From the crowd, voices began to rise. A man shouted, "Aren't you going to help her?" While another called out, "This is what happens when people aren't paying attention." These remarks carried a sharp edge, directed at the officer who had struck the woman. The officer remained silent, his jaw tightening as the pressure mounted. One woman in the crowd stepped forward, holding her phone up as she recorded the scene. "This isn't right," she said, her voice steady but filled with frustration. "She's someone's mother, someone's grandmother. She deserves better." Her words resonated, and murmurs of agreement spread among the bystanders.